A group of Christians insists they have every right to eat meat that was once offered to a pagan idol. They know the idol is nothing, just carved stone. So what's the harm? But across the same room sits another believer, deeply troubled, someone who only months earlier still bowed before that very idol. This is the argument the Apostle Paul had to settle in Corinth, and it forced him to answer a question every generation still has to face. How far does freedom go before it stops being love? By the time Paul reached this part of his letter, he had already dealt with the church's divisions, its tolerance of sexual sin and its lawsuits between believers. Now the Corinthians themselves had written to him with new questions, and one of the biggest concerned something ordinary: meat sold in the public market. The lesson this week picks up exactly here, tracing 3 long chapters, 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10, that all circle back to a single closing sentence: whatever you do, do it for the glory of God. To understand why the meat question mattered so much, it helps to picture the market itself. Just outside many temples in the Roman world stood a covered meat market known as the Macellum. Animals sacrificed to the gods during temple worship were rarely used entirely in the ritual. Priests kept a portion, sold it to butchers, and from there it moved into the ordinary flow of commerce. A shopper buying dinner that evening had almost no way of knowing whether the cut of meat in front of them had once stood on a pagan altar. In a city as densely religious as Corinth, this was not a rare exception. It was simply how meat reached most tables. Archaeology has actually confirmed how central this meat market was to daily life in Roman Corinth. Excavations near the city's forum uncovered the remains of a Macellum complex, and inscriptions from similar markets elsewhere in the Greco-Roman world use the very same Greek word Paul used in his letter for meat market. This was not an abstract hypothetical case invented for the sake of argument. It was a real building in a real part of the city that ordinary believers walked past on their way home from work. Paul was not writing about a theoretical dilemma. He was addressing a decision his readers faced almost every single week. For some believers in the Corinthian church, this created no anxiety at all. They reasoned correctly that an idol was not a real God, and that food itself carried no spiritual power one way or another. Paul agreed with the theology, but he saw a deeper problem forming inside the congregation. Some members had come out of paganism only recently. For years that same meat had been tied in their minds to real worship of real gods. Watching a fellow believer eat it casually without hesitation could shake their fragile new faith to its foundation. It might even convince them that following Christ and honoring the old gods could somehow coexist. Paul called the first group the strong and the second the weak, not as an insult, but as a description of where each stood in their spiritual journey. And his conclusion surprised many of them. He agreed that knowledge was correct, but he insisted that knowledge without love builds nothing. It can even tear a community apart. Puffed up understanding, he wrote, means little if it leaves a brother or sister spiritually wounded. Real knowledge, the kind God honors, is inseparable from love for the people standing beside you. To reinforce the point, Paul reached back to a foundational teaching every Jewish listener would have instantly recognized: the declaration that the Lord is one God, the ancient center of Israel's faith, first spoken by Moses centuries earlier. That declaration had always been followed immediately by a command to love that one God with everything a person had. Paul was showing the Corinthians that this had never been only about correct information. From the very beginning, right belief and love were meant to move together. Knowledge that puffs up and knowledge that loves God are, in the end, two very different things wearing the same name. Paul then did something his readers likely did not expect. Rather than simply instructing others to limit their freedom for the sake of weaker believers, he offered himself as proof that this kind of restraint was possible. As an apostle, he had every right to financial support from the churches he served. Other traveling teachers of his time regularly accepted payment, lodging, and provisions from the communities they taught. Paul had that same right. He also had the right, as a single man, to marry a believing wife and bring her along in ministry, fully supported by the churches, the way other apostles did, men like Peter and pairs of missionary couples such as Priscilla and Aquila, or Andronicus and Junia. and he had the right to work exclusively in ministry without needing a separate trade to survive, since he himself quoted the Lord's own instruction that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. He used none of these rights. Instead, he supported himself making tents, a demanding manual craft learned in his youth, so that no one could ever say he preached the gospel for personal profit. He mentioned a fellow worker named Barnabas doing the same, a man known elsewhere in the New Testament for his generosity, someone who had once sold property to support the earliest believers in Jerusalem. Paul's argument was not that these rights were wrong to claim. It was that giving them up when love called for it was a far more powerful witness than exercising every privilege available to him. If an apostle could set aside his own comfort for the sake of others, surely ordinary believers could set aside a plate of meat. From there, Paul shifted from his own example to a much older story, one every Corinthian familiar with Scripture would know well. The story of Israel wandering the wilderness after their escape from Egypt. He reminded them that this generation experienced extraordinary privilege. They walked beneath a miraculous cloud that guided and protected them. They passed safely through the sea. They ate food provided directly by God and drank water that flowed from solid rock. Paul described these experiences almost like a baptism and a shared meal, deliberately echoing language the Corinthians would recognize from their own experience of communion and baptism in the church. And yet, despite all of that provision, most of that generation still fell into serious sin. They grew restless and turned to idol worship, most famously constructing a golden calf while Moses was still on the mountain receiving God's law. Ancient Near Eastern art and archaeology have long shown why that particular image would have felt so natural to a people just out of Egypt. Bull and calf imagery was common across Egyptian and Canaanite religion, often used to represent strength, fertility, and the presence of a god riding invisibly upon the animal's back. It was not a random invention. It was a familiar shape borrowed from the visual language of the cultures Israel had just left and was about to enter. The people did not necessarily believe they were abandoning the Lord entirely. Many likely intended the calf as a visible pedestal for him. That in fact made the sin more dangerous, not less, because it dressed rebellion in the clothing of worship. They indulged in sexual immorality, connected in the biblical account to the very same golden calf celebration, where the people, in the words of the ancient text, rose up to play. They tested God's patience openly, and they complained bitterly against him, even after seeing his power firsthand at the Red Sea and at the mountain itself. Paul was blunt about the outcome. God was not pleased with most of them, and their bodies fell in the wilderness before ever reaching the promised land. Paul's point was not to condemn people who had lived over 1,000 years earlier. It was a direct warning to his own readers. If people who witnessed miracles that dramatic could still fall into idolatry, no believer in Corinth should feel immune simply because they now possessed greater spiritual knowledge than their ancestors. "Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall," became one of the most quoted warnings in the entire letter, precisely because it cuts against spiritual overconfidence. The lesson material draws out this same uncomfortable question directly. The phrase, "the one who thinks," suggests that some in the Corinthian church did not recognize how close they stood to the same danger. The same could easily be asked of any congregation reading the letter today. With that warning firmly in place, Paul returned to the practical question of meat sacrificed to idols, and this time he drew a sharp line most modern readers might not expect. Meat purchased in the open market, without any temple ceremony attached to the purchase, could be eaten freely, no questions asked, because the food itself carried no spiritual weight. But actually reclining at a banquet inside a pagan temple, taking part in the ritual meal itself, was an entirely different matter. That was not neutral commerce. It was active participation in worship directed toward false gods. This context also explains why Paul's answer had two very different halves rather than one simple rule. Their believer buying food at that market building had no reasonable way of tracing its origin, and demanding constant investigation into every purchase would have made ordinary life nearly impossible. Paul's solution protected conscience without creating unnecessary burdens. But a formal invitation to a temple banquet was never accidental. Attending required a deliberate choice, made with full knowledge of what the event represented. Paul consistently distinguished between unavoidable, incidental contact with a pagan culture and willful participation in its worship. That distinction still shapes how many believers today think about engaging with a surrounding culture that is not openly hostile, yet is not neutral either. Paul used one of his most vivid images to make the danger clear. Just as sharing the bread and cup of the Lord's Supper connects a believer to Christ in genuine spiritual communion, sharing a ritual meal inside a pagan temple connects a participant to whatever spiritual reality stands behind that worship. He stated it plainly: no one can drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons at the same table. No one can share in the table of the Lord and the table of demons at once. The issue was never really about food, it was about undivided loyalty. This teaching mattered enormously in a city like Corinth, where professional trade guilds regularly held their formal banquets inside temple dining halls dedicated to patron gods. A merchant, a craftsman, or a builder who refused to attend could lose business relationships built over years. Paul understood the real cost of this instruction. He was asking believers to risk their livelihoods rather than compromise where genuine spiritual loyalty was concerned. Paul grounded this warning in the language of the Ten Commandments themselves, tracing it back to Deuteronomy's declaration that the Lord alone is God and must be loved with the whole heart, soul, and strength. The same words Moses gave Israel long before any Corinthian temple was ever built. Yet Paul refused to end on rigid legalism. He returned once more to the principle of love guiding freedom, showing how the same logic Jesus taught in the Gospels applied directly here. The lesson devotes an entire day to this connection, pointing readers to two passages from the Gospel of Mark that on the surface look unrelated to idol meat, but turn out to share the very same root. The first is the account of a wealthy young man who approached Jesus, eager to inherit eternal life, confident that he had already kept every commandment since his youth. Jesus, looking at him with genuine love, told him one thing was still missing. He needed to sell what he owned, give to the poor, and follow. The man's face fell, and he walked away sorrowful because he had great possessions. Nothing in the story suggests he had broken any of the commandments about theft, murder, or dishonesty. His failure was quieter and, in some ways, more dangerous. His wealth had become the true object of his devotion, occupying the place that belonged only to God. He was, without ever bowing before a statue, a practicing idolater. The second passage records a scribe asking Jesus which commandment matters most. Jesus answered by joining two commands that many in Israel had studied separately for centuries. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Paul had already used almost identical language earlier in this same section of his letter, when he insisted that mere knowledge means nothing without love for God and love for the people around him. The rich young ruler loved his possessions more than his neighbor and more than his God. The Corinthian believer flaunting freedom at a pagan banquet, indifferent to how it might damage someone else's conscience, was walking the very same path, even if the object in his hand was a piece of meat rather than a pile of silver. That combination of total devotion to God and genuine care for others became the practical rule Paul offered the Corinthians for every gray area they might face. Not only questions about meat. Something might technically be permissible, he explained, yet still not be beneficial if it damages someone else's conscience or spiritual walk. The believer's aim should never be personal advantage alone, but the well-being of others, so that as many people as possible might be reached and saved. Paul closed this entire section of his letter with a single sentence that would become one of the most memorized verses among believers who studied this letter for centuries afterward. Whether someone eats, drinks, or does anything else at all, it should be done for God's glory. That single standard reframed even the smallest daily decision. Nothing was too small to matter, and nothing was so large that it stood outside this same measuring point. Anything that quietly took God's rightful place in a person's life, Paul warned, functioned as idolatry, regardless of whether it involved a carved statue or something far more ordinary, like comfort, self-interest, or unchecked appetite. The lesson's final study day steps outside the biblical text itself and into the writings of Ellen White, pointing readers back to the golden calf narrative once more. this time through her own retelling of the episode in the wilderness. She draws a striking connection between the ancient scene at the base of the mountain and struggles she considered universal to every generation of believers. Idolatry, in her reading, was never limited to bowing before a metal image. She described it instead as any form of self-centeredness allowed to grow unchecked, excessive love of comfort, a controlling attachment to appetite, and passions left to govern a person's choices rather than being governed by them. A worshipper could walk past every statue in Corinth without a second glance and still be practicing exactly the kind of idolatry Paul warned against, simply by letting some other desire quietly outrank devotion to God. She also raised a further, more searching question, one that connects directly back to the tension between the strong and the weak believers Paul described at the very start of this section. A believer's freedom, she suggested, should always be weighed not only by whether an act is permitted, but by whether it might close another person's mind to the truth altogether. Even something entirely innocent in itself could become an obstacle if it caused a weaker observer to stumble, hesitate, or misread the gospel's message. This was, in essence, Paul's whole argument about meat sacrificed to idols, applied outward to every choice a believer might make in full view of a watching community. Taken together, these 3 chapters trace a single arc that begins in a marketplace and ends at the very center of Christian devotion. It begins with a practical dispute over dinner, moves through Paul's own example of costly self-denial, pauses at a desert scene from 13 centuries earlier, and closes with a single standard broad enough to cover literally everything a person does. The lesson the week before this one showed that being a temple of the Holy Spirit gives believers the strength to flee sexual immorality. This lesson shows that living for God's glory in every ordinary decision, what to eat, what to attend, what to give up for someone else's sake, is what allows believers to flee idolatry in all of its many disguises, ancient and modern alike. Corinth's central danger in the end was never simply a shrine full of statues, however many of those the city possessed. It was any object, comfort, or ambition capable of quietly taking the place that belonged only to God. Whether that object was a plate of meat at a temple banquet, a fortune a rich young man could not release, or a golden calf shaped by hands still trembling with the memory of Egypt, the deeper diagnosis remained the same across every century. That danger did not disappear with the ancient world. It only changed its shape, and the same question Paul asked his readers 2,000 years ago, whether their knowledge was governed by love and whether their freedom served God's glory or merely their own comfort, remains just as searching for anyone reading this story today.